late getting started. I fell down a rabbit hole. I watched a video of a young woman in South Carolina who was pregnant for maybe 5 months, maybe less, and the baby died. And so for 3 weeks, she has been stuck with this dead fetus inside of her. And she still has not gotten the health care that she needs. This country, I'm convinced this country, especially men, hate women. I don't know how else. I don't know how else to describe it, really. A woman is being forced to carry a dead fetus for 3 weeks. And as per her last video, she still hasn't gotten anything. And I just kept scrolling through her videos, and it's been a shit show for the last week for her. She's been posting updates from the hospital, from hospital rooms, from the emergency care, and she's in tears. She does. Thank you so much for joining. Appreciate it. Thank you. She has no recourse. She doesn't know. She's going to have to leave the state, is basically what it sounds like. And even Planned Parenthood said they can't help her because she doesn't reach the criteria for a DNC. This is just fucking atrocious. This is just beyond sick. This is beyond twisted. And it ties into the book we're going to be reading today. If I can get it to focus. The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. If you read the Constitution, it talks about, in the first clause, the promotion of the general welfare of the people. That is basically the purpose, one of the many purposes laid out in the document, what this government is for, to be of the people, by the people, and for the people, and to promote the general welfare. This is not promoting the general welfare. But bear in mind, she wanted this baby. Well, no, I wouldn't say this nation was built by Christian nationalists. In fact, very few of the founding fathers were even Christians. Christian in name only. Most of them were deists, including George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. Many of them were not of a particular sect. Like, they may have been raised. The entire culture was built. No, it was not built off of European Christian values at all. No, you're still wrong, but that's okay. Foreign labor built lots of its structures. Yeah, that is true. A lot of slave labor built the capital. That's for sure. Many other places. We couldn't have afforded it any other way. See how sick and twisted that is? Anyway, I'm going to be enjoying some Elijah Craig, small batch. I've just winterized it. It's nice and cold. Because I'm just too sober for this reading. And where is my measuring cup? Oh no, it's not here. Oh, there it is. Music. Oof. Probably should clean this out sometime. Oh, too much syrup. Oh well. Tell you that walnut syrup makes it go down a whole lot easier. Just add bourbon. Yeah. Oops. Well, that's okay. I have a copy of the People's History of the United States. Should I read it? Why not? You should. Okay, let's get into the reading. Here we go. Howard Zinn's American History book. Let me see if I can. Let me just pull that up. I've been meaning to read that book, and I just have not. It's a huge tome. Oh, that's right. That you just, yeah, the People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Okay. Yeah, if you have that book, read it. Yeah, don't waste the opportunity. Okay. And away we go. Black walnut. Old-fashioned cocktail syrup. Man, I'll have to get some more of that. Here we go. Let me up so I can dismantle everything that you talk about. Yeah, you haven't dismantled much of anything, but thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Maybe after, if you're still here, you know what, this guy, here's what I'm going to do. If you're still here after I'm done reading the 2 chapters, I'll let you up and you can rip me a new one. Okay? Does that sound fun? Sound fair? Yeah, welcome back. Okay, let's read. Argument by idiom. It is much easier to alarm people than to inform them. That describes Fox News to a T. William R. Davey, delegate of the Constitutional Convention, in a letter to James Iredell during the run-up to North Carolina's ratifying convention in 1788. Pretty smart. George Washington stood tall, his 6+ feet impressive as he recited the presidential oath on April 30th, 1789, in New York City, concluding with a promise that he would, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Period. The oath of Washington's recitation both end there. The words, "So help me God," do not appear in the oath prescribed in Article 2 of the Constitution. Our godless Constitution does not ask presidents to seek a God's help or call down a God's wrath on oath breakers. There is no evidence that he even hints at Washington adding these words, nor is such an addition in keeping with his character. Contemporary accounts of the inauguration don't mention the phrase. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Monsieur, contemporaneously recorded the ceremony as he stood next to George Washington. De Monsieur's account does not include the godly language, a moment that surely would have been remarkable because the phrase is not in the Constitution. Tobias Lear was Washington's personal secretary for his final 15 years. Lear's detailed diary entry does not shy away from mentioning the religious aspects of the day, but fails to mention any religious appendage to the oath. He immediately descended from his seat and advanced through the middle door of the hall to the balcony. The others passed through the doors on each side. The oath was administered in public by Chancellor Livingston, and the moment the Chancellor proclaimed him President of the United States, the air was rent by repeating shouts and huzzas. "God bless our Washington! Long live our beloved President!" Senator William Maclay's firsthand account mentions the oath, but makes no mention of adding a phrase, nor does the Senate Journal. No newspaper accounts of the day mention the words, "So help me God." Yet many assume and assert that Washington added the appeal for divine assistance. The misconception has even snared experts like editors for the U.S. Senate Historical Office. One editor mistakenly claimed that President dating back to Washington's inauguration has said, "So help me God." Now she agrees that Chester A. Arthur was first to alter the oath. "When I made the video, it was common wisdom that Washington said it, and I did not check it. After investigating this, I would say there are no witnesses documentation. There are no eyewitnesses documentation that he did or did not say this." Most serious historians now agree that the addition of "So help me God" did not begin with Washington. Peter R. Henriquez, George Mason University professor of history emeritus and author of The Realistic Visionary, a portrait of George Washington, has written extensively on the subject, concluding there's absolutely no extant contemporary evidence that President Washington altered the language of the oath. Nobody knows Washington's words better than Edward G. Lengel, editor of George Washington Papers and of over 60 volumes of Washington's documents. Lengel concluded that any attempt to prove that Washington added the words "So help me God" requires a mental gymnastics of the sort that would do credit to the finest artist of the flying trapeze. Not only is there no evidence that Washington said the phrase, but other evidence refutes the claim. First, when Washington spoke of a God, he did not typically use the word God. In his inauguration speech given just after his oath, he uses phrases like "Almighty Being who rules the universe," "Great Author," "Benign Parent," "Invisible Hand," making it unlikely he used "So help me God" over more characteristic language. Yes, please keep tapping that screen. I love those taps. Second, Washington followed etiquette scrupulously. He compiled 110 rules on the subject of his rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. Washington presided over the debates at the Constitutional Convention for 4 long months and followed the ratification debate in Virginia closely from Mount Vernon. He knew perfectly well the precise wording of the oath that was laid out in Article 2, Section 1, and that the Constitution prohibited religious tests for public office in Article 6, Section 3. Vice President-elect John Adams and the Senate spent the entire morning debating the protocol of the inauguration ceremony down to the minutiae. "Gentlemen, I wish for the direction of the Senate. The president will, I suppose, wish to address Congress," said Adams, who then kicked off the hair splitting by asking, "How shall I behave? How shall I receive it? Shall I be standing or sitting?" It may seem absurd, but these were actually important questions for the newly found Republican nation. One that had just thrown off a monarch to consider. Settling on etiquette that was suitably Republican for federal ceremonies was a point of national honor and would help forge a national identity. Washington meticulously followed this protocol during every aspect of the inauguration. It's impossible to think that in the very act of promising to uphold the Constitution, whose shaping he had overseen word by word, he would then violate its terms by amending the carefully chosen language in the oath, especially when the document lays out procedures for amendments in Articles 5, Rule 82, in his Rules of Civility, which reads, "Undertake not what you cannot perform, but be careful to keep your promise." Washington's word was important. He couldn't swear to preserve, protect, and defend a document only to amend and thereby contravene it moments later. Third, though some oaths of the era included the phrase "So help me God," secular oaths were much more in vogue at the moment. 3 days before Washington's inauguration, on April 27, 1789, the House of Representatives passed their first bill, a godless oath of office. The Senate passed its version, also godless, 5 days after the inaugural on May 5th. Thus, not only is there a total absence of suggesting that Washington did use the words, but his own actions and character suggest that he would not have used the words. So where did this myth come from? Apparently, we have Washington Irving. Oh, there's that name again. The creator of so much early American folklore, including the legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, to thank for this myth too. The earliest claims appear nearly 70 years after the event in Rufus Griswold's The Republican Court, or American Society in the Days of Washington, 1856, and in Washington Irving's Life of Washington, 1857. Both counts rely on Washington Irving's childhood recollection. He was 6 years old at the time, as their source. According to Griswold, the 6-year-old Irving viewed the balcony inauguration from the corner of New Street and Wall Street. That a short child could hear and remember for half a century the final words of this oath, which no present or much closer adults recorded the moment did, though an innumerable throng of adults over a distance of more than 200 feet, uttered by a notoriously soft-spoken man without the aid of modern technology, is simply not to be believed. You can stand on the corner of New and Wall Street today, and I did while writing this chapter. The experiment is not perfect because the current Federal Hall, with its iconic steps, I don't know why it keeps flashing like that. Okay, there it goes again. The experiment is not perfect because the current Federal Hall with its iconic steps was built in 1842. The original Federal Hall building where the inauguration took place was razed in 1812. Washington took his oath on a balcony with no access from the street. But stand on that corner and try to peer through the streams of pedestrians to the tourists taking photos on the steps of Federal Hall. Try to hear what they are saying. Now imagine that your 6-year-old swamped in a massive throng in which you stand, at best waist high, trying to hear Washington's murmured words, and then trying to accurately recall the words you could not hear 50 years later. The claim is simply absurd. No evidence suggests that any early president, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, added pious words to the oath. The first reliable contemporaneous account of a president adding these words comes nearly a century after the founding, a Chester A. Arthur's public inauguration in 1881. Arthur was assuming Arthur was assuming what had become a dangerous office, taking the oath after James Garfield was assassinated, the second president gunned down in 16 years. This public oath was actually Arthur's second presidential oath. He had already taken the official oath and assumed the office of president 2 days earlier, immediately on Garfield's death. In that private ceremony, he did not edit the oath. The second oath, the one with the religious language, was a public reenactment done for show. This was more strategic piety. Like Arthur, Woodrow Wilson took 2 oaths, a private oath on March 4th, 1917, and a public oath the next day. Private may be the wrong word to describe the first oath. Wilson took that first oath in the Capitol at noon, and it was private only in the sense that it was not open to the public, though some governmental officials and legislators attended. This was the last truly non-public oath. Every subsequent oath taken without the pomp of a full inauguration ceremony was recorded. All the evidence suggests that Wilson did not add the phrase to the oath in the private ceremony, though he did add it to the public ceremony. The inflection point for presidents adding the words seemed to have been the United States teetering on the brink of the First World War. In fact, up through Wilson's private 1917 oath, the phrase was used in at most only 2 of 40 oaths, about 5% of the time. Beginning with Wilson's public 1917 oath, it was used in 34 of 35 oaths, about 97% of the time. Of the first 3 times the words were added, the president had already assumed office in 2, Arthur 1881 and Wilson in 1917. Yes, please keep tapping the screen. And I'm going to keep an eye on the comments if there's any questions or concerns. Okay. Let's see. He was certainly familiar with the tale of Wilson. Wilson wasn't always a politician. He was an academic first, and in 1896, he authored a poorly regarded biography of Washington. A historian, professor, and Wilson biographer has criticized the short work as resting on slender research, using a saccharine, flowery style, atypical of Wilson's writing and being generally of a low caliber. Ouch. In that romanticized biography, Wilson wrote that at the conclusion of his oath, Washington said, "So help me God," in tones no man could mistake. Thus, the modern tradition of presidents adding a god to the oath can be tied directly to the Washington Irving myth about George Washington through Woodrow Wilson. The same guy who botched the 1917 flu epidemic. Isn't it amazing? The president largely responsible for that modern trend. Myths are powerful regardless of their truth. Before the "So Help Me God" fad took hold of presidential oaths, Wilson's 1917 inauguration was one of the few wartime inaugurations up to that point in U.S. history, along with Madison's in 1813 and Lincoln's in 1865. Rather like the early 1860s and 1950s, this was a time of national fear and strife. A similar fear existed when Chester Arthur took his public oath in 1881. Though it may have been stronger in the run-up to American entering World War I, less than 5 weeks after Wilson took this pair of oaths, the U.S. would join World War I. On the very day he took the first oath, senators had been filibustering to prevent conferring additional war powers on Wilson. 2 months earlier, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and the U.S. responded by severing diplomatic relations. Just days before the oaths were uttered, the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico that would allow Mexico to reconquer Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, came to light and was confirmed as genuine by Germany. Oops. It is easy to categorize both Arthur's and Wilson's godly addition to the oath as turning to religion at times of personal fear and stress, especially given that Wilson was the son of a reverend and so pious. He frowned on dancing and found the idea of balls frivolous, that he canceled all the inaugural balls in 1913, but the claim is undercut because both men did not turn to a deity for assistance when taking the private oath, the oath that actually made them president. Instead, they snuck religion into the secular oath only in the public ceremony. The turning to religion arguments is even harder to make for America's 3 other holy epigrams. To a greater extent than "So Help Me God," these appear to have been foisted on Americans at times of national peril when their attention was turned toward more important matters, when the dissent was dangerous, and when religion was a convenient political distraction. At the Freedom from Religion Foundation offices, we often get phone calls from upset individuals wishing to register their intense disapproval of our fight to uphold the Constitution. As you would expect from someone who takes the time to call an organization with which they disagree, these individuals are less than polite. Yes, sir. Words my publisher won't print are constantly hurled at our wonderful staff, along with the occasional argument. Almost without fail, the argument takes one of 3 forms. First, "We're America, in God we trust." Second, "We're one nation under God," followed by the less than cordial invitation to move to Iran. How ironic. Finally, if they wish to disguise their passive aggressiveness by taking the high road, they either say that they are praying for us or managing to make it sound as though they are spitting on us instead, as they get presidential and say, "God bless America." Though it is hard to credit. People regularly invoke these slogans to prove that America is a Christian nation, and even a nation founded on Christian principles. It's argument by idiom. A little bit of research reveals that none of these phrases dates to the founding era. "In God We Trust" was first added to the American coinage in 1863 during the height of the Civil War. 75 years after the Constitutional Convention, it was added to paper currency in 1955 and became the national motto in 1956, "Under God." It was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. The first president to close a speech with "God Bless America" was Richard Nixon, in a mendacious presidential message about Watergate. Oh my goodness. In God we trust, one nation under God, God bless America. These tidbits are not historical so much as they are rhetorical. Their tardiness precludes arguments that that they somehow prove the founding ideology, but it is worth analyzing how the verbiage entered the American vernacular, because doing so reveals something interesting about Christian nationalism. Christian nationalists take advantage of times of fear and use them to impose their God on everyone. When doing so, they often destroy earlier unifying messages with their new divisive message. Since the first years of our founding, citizens' rights have been jeopardized and curtailed by war, or rather, our rights are curtailed, perhaps even willingly given up because of the fear of war. During the War of 1798, Congress passed the Sedition Act in an atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and intrigue that Thomas Jefferson dubbed the reign of witches. Understandably, no one today points to the ignominious Sedition Act to prove that our nation was founded on the government's ability to punish speech critical of the government. Government censorship of speech is an anathema to our founding principles. Despite the Sedition Act's passage and enforcement a mere 7 years after the First Amendment was ratified. You see how quickly you can lose your rights. It is merely a sad, short-lived example of fear trumping our founding principles. But Christian nationalists ignore this logic and recite these religious idioms, each more delinquent relative to the founding than the next, to bolster their argument. In each instance, the truant language entered the American vernacular during times of fear and national crisis, during a war in one case, and in another case at a time when witch hunters were looking for nonconformists and non-Christians, while big business was peddling religion to repeal regulations. In the final instance, the intent was to cover the most notorious presidential crimes ever committed. Chapter 24. In God We Trust, the belligerent motto. A man by the name of Pollock was once superintendent of the Mint of Philadelphia. He was almost insane about having God in the Constitution. Failing in that, he got the inscription on our money. In God We Trust. As our silver dollar is now, in fact, worth only 85 cents, it is claimed that the inscription means that we trust in God for the other 15 cents. 1884, Robert Ingersoll, in his interview with Secular Review. We used to trust in God. I think it was in 1863 that some genius suggested that it be put upon the gold and silver coins which circulated among the rich. They didn't put it on the nickels and coppers because they didn't think the poor folks had any trust in God. Mark Twain, Education and Citizenship, May 14th, 1908, in his speech. Wow. Ingersoll and Mark Twain were contemporaries. Imagine that. There are three men are ultimately responsible for getting God on the American currency: a preacher, a secretary, and a man seeking to amend the Constitution to promote his personal deity. It reads like a bad joke, but the truth is more sad than funny. The men's work spanned from late 1861 until 1864, but the final wording, "In God We Trust," was decided on in 1863 when the Civil War was at its height. That year began with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st. Conscriptions followed soon after, as did the battles of Chancellorsville, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and the two bloodiest of the war, Gettysburg and Chickamauga. Brothers were killing brothers, families and the country were being torn apart. The war would eventually kill some 750,000 Americans and more than 2% of the population, which would be equivalent to almost 8 million Americans in 2019. Walt Whitman, who was working at a military hospital in Washington, D.C. during the war, perhaps best captured the horror of the time. The dead in this war, the dead, our dead, or South or North, ours all. Our young men once so handsome, so joyous. taken from us, the son from the mother, the husband from the wife, the dear friend from the dear friend, the infinite dead, the land entire saturated, perfumed with their impalpable ashes, exhalation. And everywhere among these countless graves, we see, and ages yet may see, our monuments and gravestones, singly or in masses to thousands or tens of thousands, the significant word unknown. Not only did the war take the son from the mother, but it was also fought in America's front yards, not some foreign, faraway battlefield. It affected every citizen. 1863 was a year of great and terrible fear. The United States may be the only country that needed civil war to end slavery. Not coincidentally, it was also becoming an increasingly religious country at the time. To a larger extent than is usually discussed, the Civil War was a religious war. I am for peace under any plan or able readjustment the people will make, wrote former Illinois Governor and U.S. Representative John Reynolds in a December 17, 1862 letter to an Ohio newspaper. But in the name of God, no more bloodshed to gratify a religious fanaticism. Reynolds' wish was unfulfilled. The war dragged on for another 2.5 years. Reynolds' old attack on religious fanaticism was written against the war, but also against abolition. But his point was religious fanaticism fueling the war is accurate. Religion commanded both sides of the slavery issue. Lincoln made this point in his second inaugural. Both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each revoke his aid against the other. The bloodshed might have stemmed were it not for the unmovable certainty religious breeds in the faithful. We might say today that abolitionists motivated by religion were correct to be certain on such an obvious issue, but their brethren south of the Mason-Dixon line were just as certain, and they had the stronger side of the biblical argument. Ooh. As William Lloyd Garrison, a leading abolitionist, put it, in this country, the Bible has been used to support slavery and capital punishment, while in the old countries, it has been quoted to sustain all matter of tyranny and persecution. All reforms are anti-Bible. I will read that again. All reforms are anti-Bible. And he is correct. There is no biblical support for our rebellion against the British in 1776. We had not a religious leg to stand on. And yet they invoked the Bible. How ironic. This is not to say that religion caused slavery, but it did justify slavery and allow others to justify it. The Bible gave slavery a divine sanction. Diametrically opposed certitude on an issue like slavery, held without evidence or reason, but instead on religious faith, is a blueprint for conflict. David Goldfield makes a similar point in his book, America Aflame. America's political system could not contain the passions stoked by the infusion of evangelical Christianity into the political process. Evangelical Christianity invaded and polarized the political debate in the decades leading up to the Civil War, limiting the potential political solutions. It turned the democratic process, which relies on compromise, into a battle over sacrosanct issues of faith. Religion did exactly what the framers feared. It poisoned the political system. Incidentally, this fear was not confined to the founders, nor is it an issue the left or right need disagree on. We just didn't want the tea. You know what's amazing? Can you imagine if the British had won the Revolutionary War? We'd all be speaking English. Proper English. Anyway, with better accents. Anyway, the father of the modern conservative movement, Barry Goldwater, recognized and feared the inflexibility of religion in politics in 1994 when he famously insisted, if and when these preachers get control of the Republican Party, and they're sure trying to do so, it's going to be a terrible damn problem. Frankly, these people frighten me. Politics and governing demand compromise, but these Christians believe they are acting in the name of God, so they can't and won't compromise. Goldfield dates the launch of religious political invasion to the 1844 presidential race between Democrats James K. Polk and Whig Henry Clay and James Birney of the Liberty Party. From then on, the political parties paraded their religious bona fides and attacked opponents as infidels. The campaign themselves came to resemble religious revivals as much as a political exercise. Religion was not only an issue itself, it permeated other issues of the day, especially slavery. The country's first major religious political party, the Liberty Party, founded in 1839, gained prominence and then used spiritual blackmail to win votes by telling citizens to vote the Liberty ticket as a religious duty. The party hosted revival-like conventions and was, according to one of its leaders, unlike any other party in history because it was founded on moral principles, on the Bible, originated a contest not only against slavery but against atheistic politics from which divine law was excluded. Religion had been largely absent from politics and government up to that point. The Liberty Party bemoaned the common law of political life, that religion has nothing to do with politics. But that separation, so assiduously cultivated by the founders, was obliterated during the buildup of tensions that was released in the Civil War. According to Goldfield, churches became party gathering places. Ministers stumped for the party's candidates and even served as poll watchers. Religion became a political weapon. More than a decade before the war, Daniel Webster, who served as Secretary of State, U.S. Senator, U.S. Representative, warned Congress about the passion religion creates when it mixes with politics. Examining the history of slavery, he also warned Congress about the historical justification for slavery, including those found in Judeo-Christianity. There was slavery among the Jews. The theocratic government of that people made no injunction against it. Webster explained, adding later, and I suppose there is to be found no injunction against that relation between man and man in the teachings by the gospel of Jesus Christ or any of his apostles. Webster then warned against mixing religion and politics. When a question of this kind takes hold of the religious sentiments of mankind and comes to be discussed in religious assemblies of the clergy and laity, there is always to be expected or always to be feared a great deal of excitement. It is in the nature of man, manifested by his whole history, that religious disputes are apt to become warm, and men's strength of conviction is proportionate to their views of the magnitude of the questions. Webster found it curious that believers failed to realize how unconvincing religious arguments are to everyone else. They do not remember that the doctrines and miracles of Jesus have, in 1800 years, converted only a small portion of the human race. And among the nations that are converted to Christianity, they forget how many vices, crimes, in public and private, still prevail, and that many of them, public crimes especially, which are offenses against the Christian religion, pass without exciting particular regret or indignation. Of course, we are correct today to treat slavery as an intolerable violation of human rights, one on which no compromise is possible. The North was morally justified to fight a war to free the slaves if that was necessary. But there had not been a divine justification for slavery to begin with. The institution might have failed without a war. Religion on both sides solidified arguments, many untenable, as articles of faith. That was Webster's point, and that was the point of Lincoln's religious language in his second inaugural address. Northerners used the Bible to justify their position, and some, in the throes of the misnamed Second Great Awakening, thought that reforming their society by abolishing slavery would even bring on the second coming of Jesus Christ, according to Goldfield. But the South, though morally wrong, had a stronger religious argument for its position and was therefore far less likely to do away with slavery because of religious pleading or moral reasoning. After all, God was on their side. The Confederate States of America motto said, Deo vindice, God will vindicate, or with God our protector. The motto meant to call upon the Christian God. The South believed in the righteousness, in the religious sense of its cause. To evangelical Christians, explained Goldfield, the secession and formation of the Confederate States of America represented a rebirth, just as they had been reborn in Christ. After secession, the South rushed to inject religion into politics wherever possible, such as in its motto. The Confederacy essentially copied the 1787 U.S. Constitution's preamble, but added the one thing the Confederacy thought most important, a clause invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, thought that slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible in both Testaments, from Genesis to Revelation. It has existed in all ages and has been found among the people of the highest civilizations and in nations of the highest proficiency in the arts. He might have added that Abraham, the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam owned slaves. At the behest of his barren wife, Sarah, Abraham impregnated her slave Hagar and married her as well. Handmaid's Tale, anyone? Jefferson Davis and Daniel Webster were right. The Bible supported the Southern slaveholders, not the Northern abolitionists. The point was even made in the House of Representatives during the first U.S. Congress. 2 months after his death, 2 months before his death, Benjamin Franklin petitioned Congress to abolish slavery. Franklin was in an abolition society that included Thomas Paine and other founders and Quakers. Representative James Jackson of Georgia attacked the petition, at least partly because the Bible allows slavery. Quote, if the petitioners were to consult the book which claims our regard, they will find that slavery is not only allowed but commended. Their Savior, who possessed more benevolence and commiseration than they pretend to, has allowed for it. Representative William Smith of South Carolina also favored slavery on religious grounds, as the professors of its Christianity's mild doctrines never preached against it. Slavery is sanctified and permitted in the Bible. Jesus even discusses the proper force with which to beat one's slave in Luke chapter 12, a passage the Southern states often use to justify slavery. Another major argument for slavery was not just biblical sanction, but that Christianity civilized the black race by bringing them to Jesus. Slavery created Christians. This is why Christianity is so prevalent in the black community. Reverend Frederick A. Ross, author of Slavery Ordained of God, in 1857, wrote that harmony amongst Christians, which can be preserved only by the view that slavery is of God, and to continue for the good of the slave, the good of the master, the good of the whole American family, until another and better destiny may be unfolded. William C. Daniel of Georgia, a gentleman having the talent, education, and comprehensive view to do justice to so grave a subject, spoke extensively to a Southern agricultural Congress on the civilizing benefit of the slave in 1854. Daniel thought of the operation of slavery generally throughout Christendom had been to civilize the slaves. He preached that Southern agriculture's goal should include cultivating the aptitudes of the black race for civilization and consequently Christianity. Freedom would come eventually, but not by imposing upon them the duties and penalties of civilization before they have cast off the features of their African barbarism. That's a direct quote. This civilization gospel rationalized slavery and imposed a duty on slave owners to use the subjugation to prepare the African race for civilization and subsequently Christianity. Oh, yeah. Slaveholders believed themselves to be executing the Christian duty to love our neighbors by civilizing their slaves, by bringing them out of the barbarisms and idolatries of paganism. As Daniel put it, by exposing the African race to the humanizing influence of Christianity through their bonds, the slavers believed they were doing the slaves a favor. They were saving Africans by enslaving them. That takes some George Orwell 1984 mental gymnastics to actually make sense of that. Let me reread that. The slavers believed they were doing the slaves a favor. They were saving Africans by enslaving them. The slave owners justified enslaving an entire race using the perceived superiority of Christianity. If slavery was a divine trust, abolition was also atheistic. The month before South Carolina seceded, Reverend Benjamin Palmer of the First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans delivered a Thanksgiving sermon on the division seizing the country. Quote, "Last of all, in the great struggle, we defend the cause of God and religion. The abolition spirit is undeniably atheistic." How ironic. Thank you so much for joining. I appreciate that. Among a people so generally religious as the American, a disguise must be worn, but it is the same old threadbare disguise of the advocacy of human rights, this spirit of atheism. Who knew? Atheism is tied directly to advocacy of human rights. I'll take that. This spirit of atheism, which knows no God, who tolerates evil, no Bible which sanctions the law, and no conscience that can be bound by oaths and covenants, has selected us for its victims and slavery for its issue. To be pro-slavery was to be pro-Bible. Abolitionists were atheists and anti-biblical, according to this preacher. Today, many might doubt these religious rationales for slavery, believing the church to have been the major force for abolition or above reproach. Religion played an important role in the abolition movement, but it played a bigger role on the other side of the argument. While speaking to an audience in London in 1846, Frederick Douglass encountered a vocal doubter as to the culpability of churches. The report of that encounter, noting the crowd reaction in parenthesis, survives. Okay. Mr. Douglass, why, as I said in another place to a smaller audience the other day in answer to the question, Mr. Douglass, are there not Methodist churches, Baptist churches, Congregational churches, Episcopal churches, Roman Catholic churches, Presbyterian churches in the United States and in the southern states of America? And do they not have revivals of religion, accessions to their ranks from day to day? And will you tell me that these men are not followers of the meek and lowly Savior? Most unhesitatingly, I do. Revivals in religion and revivals in the slave trade go hand in hand together. I'll say that again. Revivals in religion and revivals in the slave trade go hand in hand together. The church and the slave prison stand next to each other. The groans and the cries of the heartbroken slave are often drowned in the pious devotion of the religious master. The church-going bell and the auctioneer's bell chime in with each other. The pulpit and the auctioneer's block stand in the same neighborhood. While the blood-stained gold goes to support the pulpit covers the infernal business with the garb of Christianity. We have men sold to build churches, women sold to support missionaries, and babies sold to buy Bibles. and communion services for the churches. A voice. It is not true, Mr. Douglas. Not true. It is not? Hear the following advertisement. Field Negroes by Thomas Gadsden. I read now from the American Church, The Bulwarks of American Slavery by an American, or by J.G. Burney. This has been before the public in this country and the United States for the last 6 years. Not a fact, not a statement in it has been called in question. The following is taken from the Charleston Courier of February 12, 1835. Field Negroes by Thomas Gadsden. On Tuesday, the 17th, will be sold at the north of the exchange at 10 o'clock. A prime gang of 10 Negroes accustomed to the culture of cotton and provision, belonging to the Independent Church in Christchurch Parish. Here's an example of a church actually engaged in the slave trade. I could read other testimony on this point, but is it necessary? Some Christian sects advocated abolition, the Quakers before almost everyone else, but most took a while to come around. Christianity's switch to pro-abolition may have been driven by secular forces. Quote, on a profound moral dilemma like slavery, one might expect people to derive their views from religion, writes Professor Mark Smith, while counterexamples can be found. The more common pattern over hundreds of years show the tail wagging the dog. That is, secularism drove religion to abolition. Smith has pointed out that Christian resistance to slavery was nowhere to be found when the colonies instituted slavery in the 1600s, and that the timing of Northern emancipation suggests that secular rather than religious forces were the primary cause. Secular forces drove religious sects to re-examine their collective consciences, or as Smith puts it, religious advocacy trailed behind the path secular ideas had already laid. Even if secular culture did not primarily liberalize religion, it is clear that religion justified slavery for centuries and that the chief moral justification for American slavery was religious. Again, Christianity may not have caused slavery. Slavery predates Christianity and factors other than religion, such as economics. Economics play a role, but in America, Christianity and the Bible justified slavery and allowed otherwise moral people to assuage their consciences by telling themselves that they were acting in accord with God's law. That divine sanction was critical. To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he is doing is good, or else that it's a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. Whatever factors caused slavery, Christianity helped make its patent immorality palatable to believers. Both sides had religious arguments to buttress their position. The idea that God is on our side breeds a certainty that no logic, reason, or fact can shake. Thomas Jefferson was right to tremble for his country after poetically reflecting that God's justice cannot sleep forever. Religious fervor brought God's war to America, and we bled for it. As the war progressed, the piety on both sides began to subside. The randomness of death, regardless of piety, and the general horror of war transformed soldiers' faith, according to Goldfield. Herman Melville captured the general disillusionment with the war in his haunting poem, Shiloh, a Requiem, April 1862, which tells of a church filled with dead and dying soldiers from both sides uttering their natural prayers. Melville asks, what, like a bullet, can undeceive? Ouch. The realities of war shattered the deception of faith. As commanders have for millennia, Civil War generals and preachers stoked soldiers' piety, recognizing religion's usefulness in convincing men and boys to march to their death without fear because God is on their side. Margaret Mitchell commented on this phenomenon in Gone with the Wind. Rhett Butler dryly asks, if the people who started wars didn't make them sacred, who would be foolish enough to fight? The soldiers recorded their disenchantment. Major Abnell Small of the 16th Maine Volunteers attended his brigade chaplain service before the Battle of Chancellorsville, the fourth bloodiest battle of the war, also fought in 1863. The chaplains besought us all to stand firm, to be brave, God being our shield. We had nothing to fear, recalled Small. But when a Confederate bombardment hit camp during the service, the explosion of shells, the screams of the horses, the shouted commands of officers were almost drowned out by the yells and laughter of the men as the brave chaplains, hatless and bookless, their coattails streaming in the wind, fled madly to the rear over stone walls and hedges and ditches, followed by the soldiers' gleefully shouted counsel, "Stand firm! Put your trust in the Lord!" Can you imagine? You're in an encampment, and the very religious leaders who are telling you not to worry, God has it under control, he will be your shield. As soon as the bombing starts, they hightail and run. Confederate Captain Alexander Hunter observed that devotional exercise languished, except in a few favored localities. It is hard to retain religion on an empty stomach. A famine-stricken man gains consolation from no creed. Soldiers had gone through so much that many of them honestly thought, as one ragged sinner profanely put it, quote, they had such a hell of a time in this country that the good Lord would not see them damned to the next. That's pretty sad. Soldiers began to throw away their Bibles over the chaplain's protest because Bibles and blisters didn't go well together. Open contempt of ministers followed. Massachusetts soldier Theodore Lyman, General Meade's aide-de-camp, recorded his views on one chaplain. He was like all of the class patriotic, one-sided, attributed to the Southerners' ever fiendish passion, in support of which he had accumulated all the horrible accounts of treatment of prisoners, slave, etc., and had worked himself into a great state. Colonel Richard Hinton wrote an account of his recovery in the Union's Armory Square Hospital in Washington, D.C. for the Cincinnati Commercial. He had plenty of visitors who packed his meager personal space full of tracts and testaments. Every Sunday, about 6 preachers would come into my ward and preach and pray and sing to us while we were swearing to ourselves all the time and wishing the blamed old fools would go away. Hinton preferred the visits from the free-thinking Walt Whitman, the old heathen whose funny stories and his pipes and tobacco were worth more than all the preachers and tracts in Christendom. It's amazing. The ebb of religion in the ranks of the conflict dragged on is well documented by the soldiers themselves. Before the disillusioning bullets extinguished the pious fervor, the Christian God was placed on American coinage. At the end of 1861, Mart Watkinson, the preacher in our tale of Christian nationalism, wrote a letter to the Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, proposing godly language for American coinage. Watkinson raised what he believed was a seriously overlooked issue, the recognition of the Almighty God in some form in our coins. Watkinson did not know Salmon Chase personally, but presumptuously began his letter, "You are probably a Christian." After noting that they were both members of that club, Watkinson moved to fear-mongering, asking, "What if our republic were now shattered beyond reconstruction?" If that were to happen, Watkinson argued, posterity would look at America's coinage and rightly reason from our past that we were heathens. That we were a heathen nation. Watkinson proposed removing that heathen, the goddess of liberty, and putting on a new motto, words such as God, liberty, and law. With the sense of entitlement typical of a religious majoritarian, Watkinson claimed that no possible citizen could object to such language. The change, Watkinson concluded, would relieve us from the ignominy of heathenism. This would place us openly under the divine protection we have personally claimed. From my heart, I have felt our nation our national shame in disowning God as not the least of our present national disasters. To our first, I address a subject that must be agitated. As a self-styled minister of the gospel, Watkinson had time to consider such a minutia, and how he could best impose his religion on a population distracted by a bloody war. Other preachers, such as Reverend Abe Boardman of Philadelphia, joined his fight. What better way to spread their version of the good word than by putting it on currency everyone has to use? In fact, that was one reason Congress added the phrase to paper currency during the Red Scare of the 1950s, to spread the gospel behind the Iron Curtain, as one congressman put it. How did that work out? Was the gospel spread behind the Iron Curtain by putting God on our money? Anyone want to weigh in? How did that work out in the end? In a 1907 congressional debate on the phrase, after Teddy Roosevelt refused to include it on the 10 and 20 gold coins because doing so was irreverent and bordering on sacrilege, Representative Ollie James declared, "We are sending to foreign countries and to distant people our missionaries to preach the religions of Jesus Christ. And then when this gold is held in the hands of those who do not know of the existence of the Savior of the world, we can say, here are the dollars of the greatest nation on earth. One that does not put its trust in floating navies or in marching armies, but places its trust in God." Wow, the audacity. Forget that we did put our trust in entire navies and armies, because we sent them all over the place. After Cuba, we went to the halls of Montezuma. We went to the Philippines and took them over. We took over Guam. We went into Haiti. Disgusting shit. U.S. currency would effectively become a Christian missionary, and it began with this preacher and secretary. Chase took Watkinson's suggestion seriously and wrote the director of the Mint, James Pollock, discussing how a nation becomes strong enough to win a war. No nation can be strong except in the strength of God, or safe except in his defense. The trust of our people in God should be declared on our national coins. Pollock must have been overjoyed to read Chase's suggestion. He would go on to be the vice president of the National Convention to secure the religious amendment of the Constitution of the United States, a group dedicated to injecting God into America's godless Constitution, as the South had done to its Constitution. Similar efforts had failed repeatedly since almost immediately after the Constitution was first proposed. Failing to impose his religion by amending one government instrument did not stop him from using his government office to do so. Pollock believed that because the United States is a Christian nation, the time for the introduction of this or a similar motto is propitious and appropriate. Quote, "'Tis an hour of national peril and danger, an hour when men's strength is weakness, when our strength and our nation's salvation must be in God of battles. Must be in the God of battles." Pollock could not have been more explicit about desiring to take advantage of the nation's fear. He went so far as to declare the war lucky. Propitious, fear, is a friend to those who would violate inalienable rights, including the right to a secular government. On December 9th, 1863, Secretary Chase approved the final language, "In God we trust." Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the 7K likes. Keep tapping. I appreciate that. Yes, thank you so much. My goodness, your fingers must be tired. Whew. Congress made the change official a few months later when it passed the new coinage bill, though it did not actually vote on the new language. It simply gave the Mint director, Pollock, the power to fix the shape, the motto, the devices of the coins with the approval of the Treasury Secretary. Oh, so a Christian basically abused the power of his office, and that's how we got to where we are at with the coinage. Nice. How on brand. So, at the advice of a proselytizing preacher, two government officials, one with a religious agenda so all-consuming he was trying to amend the Constitution to honor his God, deliberately used the time of national peril and danger when people were too busy dying for the Constitution to protect it from the rear guard assault to promote their personal religion. Even if this edition were not decades after the founding, it's hard to see how three men betraying a founding principle, keeping state and church separate, is itself a founding principle. Watkinson, Pollock, and Chase took advantage of a fearful, distracted nation and abused their government offices to impose their personal religious beliefs on all citizens. There is a perverse irony in these three men choosing to promote the world's most divisive force, religion, when fighting a war to preserve a national union. To choose something so quintessentially divisive to replace a unifying sentiment in the middle of a war that actually sundered the nation shows hubris typical of religious privilege. The three imagined that the fate of our nation hinged not on reunification or full equality for Black Americans, but on placing a reference to the Christian God on coins, which luckily could be done given the nation's fear. One would think that this idea would not appeal to those who think highly of their God. Those great philosophers who formed the Constitution had a higher idea of the perfection of the infinite mind which governs all worlds than to suppose they could add to his honor or glory, and that he would be pleased with such low familiarity or vulgar flattery. That author, writing in 1788, was discussing objections to the godlessness of American Constitution during the ratification debates, but the point is apt. The founding generation adopted very different language for U.S. coinage. The Continental Congress in April 21st, 1787, just before the Constitutional Convention met, resolved to create a new copper cent. On July 6th, they selected a design by Benjamin Franklin. One side, it was described, Fugio, mind your business, with a sun and sundial. Fugio means I fly, and the sundial together means time flies. The other side contained a unifying message. 13 interlocking rings around the perimeter, one from each state, made a chain. Within the chain was a smaller circle with the words United States circumscribed. Within the circle was the words, we are one. These two designs appeared on earlier paper continental currency dating to February 1776, before the Declaration of Independence. These paper notes, fractional bills as they are known, had the same 13 interlocking rings, forming a strong chain and the inner circle with we are one. Ben Franklin designed this early unifying theme, something he had a talent for, if his join or die snake print is any indication. The U.S. Congress, following Alexander Hamilton's advice, established the U.S. Mint in 1792. It decreed that coins should have an impression emblematic of liberty, and the words liberty on one side and an eagle with the United States of America on the other side. Another early coin was inscribed Liberty, parent of science and industry. The only deity that used to appear on U.S. coins was the metaphorical goddess Liberty. If you are still under the delusion that we are founded on Christianity, I have to say there is no amount of facts or reason that would reach you at this point. The original maxim that appeared on many American coins still appears on U.S. currency, also had unifying language, e pluribus unum, from many one, or out of many one. On the day the Second Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence, it also appointed the same three men responsible for the Declaration, Jefferson, Franklin, and John Adams, to a committee to recommend the Great Seal, which would appear on American currency. Ben Franklin actually proposed a national seal featuring imagery from the Exodus myth, as did Jefferson. But the proposal, like Franklin's proposal for prayer at the Constitutional Convention, they were rejected. Those rejections, perhaps because of their religious nature, though that is unclear, say more about the propriety of a secular republic adopting religious imagery than about the initial proposals. Many variations, and the new committee dealt with the issue for more than 8 years. But these three drafters, with help from French émigré Pierre-Eugène du Cimetière, decided on the unifying motto, E pluribus unum. The three fearmongers of the 1860s sought to undo the work of these great men. The original idea expressed the idea that the belief that people or states with differences can come together to form a great country. The religious motto expresses an inherently divisive religious belief and applies to only a portion of the population. That language would not only trump the unifying sentiment on our coins, but also officially become America's national motto during another great time of fear, the Red Scare of the 1950s. And thus concludes our reading of chapters 23 and 24. The next time we meet again, it'll be 25 and 20. Ooh, you know what? Maybe just chapter 25. Oh, you know what? 25 and 26 are the last two chapters of this book. So the next time we meet, we shall read the last two chapters. That's it. I have spoken. Well, thank you so much for enjoying. Well, thank you for listening to my ramblings and poor reading. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody wants to challenge what has been read? I'm still waiting for this one guy to come back. Anybody wants to join the discussion, you can request to come on up and let me have it. Or stop me from drinking the rest of this. Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Small batch, 1789. Do we have any takers? Do we have any guests? Come on up. I'll wait a little bit. For those of you watching on YouTube, I'll go ahead and end this stream. Thank you so much for watching. And if you are on TikTok, we'll continue the discussion even further.